I know from the thumbnail it can be an obvious fix to just say, make Euron Greyjoy more like his book counterpart, but I want to go in depth with what is wrong with the show version of Euron so we can then fix his issues. Where did David and Dan and the actor portraying him go so wrong? Firstly, to me, one of the most jarring reasons why Euron sticks out in a bad way is his acting. In the book, A Fire Cannot Kill a Dragon, which is mostly a collection of interviews behind the scenes in Game of Thrones, we find out a key lesson that Jason Momoa and Rory McCann learned during their portrayal of Khal Drogo and Sandor Clegane. Their main revelation is that less is more, and that style of acting can speak volumes when their physical stature alone intimidates people. They didn't have to play up their acting and go crazy, because just beaming someone in the eyes is just as scary as acting like a lunatic. That, and by going full-blown wacky in a show that establishes a different tone and style in acting, the character Euron Greyjoy stands out like a sore thumb. He seems like a two-dimensional, ridiculous pirate, and we never really get scenes with his character to really flesh him out. We are naturally going to compare Euron to past villains in Game of Thrones, and when those villains weren't as ridiculous as Euron, then on a comparison basis, that makes him even worse. Because arguably Joffrey and Ramsay are just as crazy as Euron, and if not way more, and them on their own never exuded the same type of wacky energy that Euron does. Sure, Joffrey and Ramsay have some chaotic and scary moments, but the reason why those moments stand out so much and make them menacing is because they're normally more reserved and are utilizing the fact that less is more. Take Ramsay as an example, a character who is batshit insane, but in a lot of his scenes, he's normally more collected and calculating, making it to where that puts the audience on edge because you never know when he's going to snap and do something hideous. This made his scenes with Theon Greyjoy so terrifying because we never knew when Ramsay was suddenly going to get angry and hurt our beloved character even more. However, with Euron, he can never achieve that level of intimidation because he's always overly wacky and wild for the sake of just being spontaneous and unpredictable. Then there's also the issue of character direction and the acting that comes along with that. In A Fire Cannot Kill a Dragon, it was revealed that the intention for the character was to make him more like a quote-unquote rock star. Dan Weiss says, "We really haven't had somebody in the show who has kind of a rock star swagger." Hearing that quote really just makes me sick to my stomach, and trust me, it gets worse. They even went to the costume designer to make Euron look like a rock star by dressing him up in leather and guyliner. Which, as a comparison to the books, is straight up blasphemy from how much cooler his design was. Like, imagine this design from the books with an actor that isn't overacting and is instead being silent and menacing, again calling back to less is more. Then Jeremy Potessois, one of the directors, stated that the script suggested that Euron was sexy and funny. So Pilo Asbæk, the actor who plays Euron, played up that aspect of the character. In Season 7, Pilo insisted to David and Dan that his character needed to be overly arrogant and charming for the scene where he meets up with Jaime Lannister, because he had more confidence to stand up for his rendition of the character by that point in the show. Upon his delivery of that scene, David and Dan were actually really happy that they allowed him to portray the character in that way. Dan Weiss states, to have somebody traipse onto the stage with the swagger and attitude that Euron had was a lot of fun because it lets air into the room. So from all these behind-the-scenes revelations, it's painfully clear that David and Dan and the actor portraying Euron wanted to deliver a villain that was drastically worse than the books. And on the subject of Euron Greyjoy being changed into a Frankenstein monster of Captain Jack Sparrow and a rock star, let's look at his character in the books and see how David and Dan had great material to work with, but ultimately ignored it. In the books, Euron is a cunning, sharp, and manipulative, intimidating figure that constantly plays mind games with any of his surrounding subjects. He also has a much cooler and badass design where he wears black scale armor, and he even has an eye patch that supposedly hides a black eye shining with malice. So right away, that's way better than a hobo in leather and guyliner. There's also a more magical aspect to his character in which he drinks Shade of the Evening that stains his lips, and in general, he's way more obsessed with learning magic that can aid him in bringing about an apocalypse. Something that is entirely dropped from the show, along with his meat crew called the Silence. They are briefly mentioned in Season 8, but barely any emphasis was put on that. So really it seems like one of the only shared characteristics these two characters have is that they are both kind of unpredictable, and that's it. But Euron in the show is unpredictable because it feels like he just acts spontaneously, and is just trying to be overly crazy. Meanwhile in the books, Euron is unpredictable because we don't necessarily know the exact scale of his ambitions and the drastic lengths he is willing to go to. In terms of fixing Euron Greyjoy, it's only realistic for the show to draw upon the essence of Book Euron and how he looks and acts, because his story arc in the book won't really work as a direct one-to-one adaptation in the show, especially since they are introducing him in season 6. You can technically introduce him much sooner and try to execute his book narrative in a perfect world, but if we are working with the show, then I think making him look and act like Book Euron will be the best David and Dan could have done, but for some idiotic reason, they didn't utilize that. One integral aspect that makes a villain stand out is that they need to make a major impact so they can be feared. Looking at Euron, the main impact he has made before the final season to set him up as a villain was killing Balon Greyjoy, failing to kill Yara and Theon Greyjoy, and killing the Sand Snakes. So not the best rap sheet in comparison to other villains in which they have done truly horrible acts, like Joffrey killing Ned Stark and torturing Sansa, Tywin orchestrating the Red Wedding and constantly beating down his own family, and Ramsay torturing and castrating a character for multiple seasons. These characters make massive impacts and thoroughly change the show from their actions. So right away you're probably like, yeah, Euron doesn't really make a great impact in comparison to these villains. He just yeets Balon off a bridge, a character who doesn't even show up for seasons 4 and 5, and only has one brief appearance in season 3. So his epic introduction is him killing a character that most people watching the show don't really care about anymore and has no more relevance. In the books, Balon Greyjoy's death happens way sooner, around the point of season 2 or 3 for the show, so by extending out his show presence all the way to season 6, because that's when he chose to introduce Euron, it leaves very little source material to work with for Balon, which thus leads to his character being largely absent, destroying his relevance in the process. Then him killing the Sand Snakes, if anything, was way more exciting and cathartic for the audience because of how much everyone hated them, and it felt like fan service. Euron doesn't make a great impact currently, and to me there was a somewhat obvious fix to this problem, and that answer is in the books. I know this requires more build-up and introducing more characters, but by neutering the Iron Islands plotline, you simultaneously neuter Euron. Because in the books, it's revealed that he's killed 3 of his brothers, making him a major kinslayer. However, in the show, the impact of him being a kinslayer is heavily reduced because of the fact that the Greyjoy house is virtually empty in comparison to the books.
People I was cutting down were your own kin. Place was getting crowded.
So how can this character fanatically kill a bunch of his brothers when he doesn't even have any in the show besides Balon? This also leads to a lot less conflict within the Iron Islands given that he only has a few relatives instead of a handful more Greyjoys for him to manipulate. So right away upon his introduction and even throughout his time on the show, there is nothing that happens that declares Euron as an important villain. And even though he makes a bigger impact in season 8 by killing one of Daenerys' dragons and getting the final blow on Jamie, those events still don't manage to make him a better villain. For Rhaegal's death, it felt extremely contrived and unrealistic, which thus robs Euron from gaining any form of antagonistic clout. Because right away, the audience will just be annoyed from the fact that Dany didn't know about the Iron Fleet despite being reminded about them the scene prior, and how she didn't see a massive fleet in the ocean, and so on and so on. Then for Euron's other big moment in which he fights Jamie, that moment is also heavily contrived because of how convenient it was for him to swim ashore at the exact time and place in which Jamie was entering the Red Keep. Not to mention that the fight between Euron and Jamie was essentially pointless because Jamie just died to bricks instead of his wound. So even in a season where he's fighting an active war, his character still can't stand out as an impactful villain. One reason why Euron in the show may seem like a boring character to follow is that his primary goal and motivation is to mainly have sex with Cersei.
Ever since I was a little boy, I wanted to grow up and marry the most beautiful woman in the world.
You serious?
Which for a man who has traveled all over the world and has experienced many fine women most likely, primarily having this motivation is weird. Now it can also be about power, but if it was about that, he would betray Cersei in a heartbeat and would take the Iron Throne for himself. Now, obviously no one would want to see this buffoon on the Iron Throne, but it doesn't make sense from his character's perspective to be so loyal to someone he doesn't really know and shouldn't care about, given that he killed his own brother in an attempt to become king. So he would easily be classified as self-serving, but now he's trying to win the heart of Cersei? Unless if this is just all a play to one-up Jaime Lannister, since he seems overly obsessed with the man in season 8. So currently, Euron doesn't have a realistic goal that isn't contrived for the story, and it seems like he primarily operates to make Cersei's side seem stronger. In the books, he has nothing to do with Cersei, and he has his own entire agenda going on, so you can't look there for any possible solutions for this show. So really the only thing to do is to drastically change the character to fit the new story, which is essentially what David and Dan did, which simultaneously in their rendition of the character, ruined him. What they should have done instead was give Euron more consistency in terms of motivation and goals. Instead of having a weird mix of everything that amalgamates into a horny pirate that wants to be loved, who kind of wants more power, it doesn't necessarily want to kill his relatives, and also wanting to at the same time. To me, what seems like a more realistic approach to the show version of Euron is a man obsessed with power, and getting revenge on his relatives for making him look weak when they stole his fleet. And along the way of gaining his revenge, he also simultaneously gets closer to Cersei with the motivation of betraying her and getting more power, not fall in love with her. So obviously Jamie sees through that and eventually confronts him much sooner and fights him before season 8. This would also give a lot more scenes within King's Landing season 7 narrative, since as it is, it's extremely sparse, and there's really nothing going on there since the High Sparrow is gone. So why not have Euron be the villain threat for King's Landing that season, and by the end, Jamie has to confront him and rid this treasonous parasite before he kills Cersei. And Cersei may be blinded by the fact that she's so obsessed with trying to beat Daenerys and Tyrion that she's getting desperate for more allies. This is really the only course I can see realistically happening with Euron in the show that isn't overly ridiculous and contrived. Because in season 8, it just feels like he's a tacked on villain that doesn't really have anything to offer. And this is also just me briefly spitballing, trying to come up with a better arc for the character, and I'm surprised that David and Dan took years to come up with what they did, and how terrible it was. For one last quick aspect that should be entirely removed from Euron is his humorful spirit. Humor is a double-edged sword and is a really hard personality trait to incorporate for your villain, because as we know through the show, it can drastically undercut any serious and menacing tone that the villain has going for them, and instead turns them into a buffoon.
A finger in the bum. Not now. We'll talk later.
And since David and Dan seem to be pretty incompetent at writing original riveting dramatic dialogue, they take the easy way out with having their characters crack unfunny jokes more frequently. How can you be intimidated by someone who is making cock jokes in almost every scene he is in?
Even heard you have no cock. That's the sort of thing you start to say once your dick gets chopped off. Along with my big cock.
In Fire Cannot Kill a Dragon, Pilo even stated that he was doing a comedy show for the Iron Islands, which is absolutely absurd that he thinks that he can give a stand-up routine as one of the introductory scenes of a villain. If you really want to make humor work with a villain, use it as a form of bait and switch. Disarm your subject with humor, and then come in with your lethality. Kind of what happens with Ramsay, acting more lighthearted to then switch suddenly to be more scary, to catch Theon off guard in a more vulnerable state. However, with Euron, his humorful side is just there for him to be more charismatic and eccentric, which are characteristics that don't make a great villain in this context. These characteristics can work for a villain, but not for Euron Greyjoy, a character that is supposed to be a menacing leader that strikes fear amongst his ranks, not someone at Kingsmoot who is trying to make people laugh and love him in an attempt to win everyone's hearts so he can become king. Who has a better cock than Euron the Long? So from deleting his humorful side, changing his goals and overall arc to be more realistic and consistent, giving him more of an impact so he can be feared, improving the acting and direction of the character and his design, and trying to make him as close to his book counterpart as possible is how I think you can fix a seemingly unfixable character. Thank you for watching and have a great day.